The city of Brisbane, often referred to in the Turrbal language as Mianjin, was founded on the 13th of May 1825 as a British penal colony, only for the most severe of criminals already sent to Australia. In today's world, Brisbane is the third most populous city in Australia and across the continent, and it is the state capital of the State of Queensland, which was created in 1859. This video is going to look at the founding of the Brisbane settlement in 1825, but also looking at the months before, the expedition to find the said site and why it was chosen, but also looking at the months after the founding of Brisbane, how the convicts and the Marines there coped with these early days of settlement. Without further ado, let's go. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all, from those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video, and let's get straight to it. Now, in order to understand the establishment of Brisbane, we have to go back in time a little bit to the year 1821, and a few hundred kilometres south to the city of Sydney, which was the Port Jackson colony of the time. Now, why would I have to go there? Well, you see, on the 1st of December 1821, the governor of Port Jackson, Lachlan Macquarie, was replaced by a man called Sir Thomas Brisbane. Sir Thomas Brisbane is the man whom the city of Brisbane is named after. Thomas Brisbane was brought in because the previous governor, Lachlan Macquarie, was becoming a largely unpopular figure. His large-scale urbanisation project and building works were large, but very, very expensive. He didn't really have much planning permission from the Colonial offices in London, and so had ruffled a few feathers. This was, after all, supposed to be a penal colony, where convicts were supposed to undergo harsh treatment, not undergo acts of frivolity and create a new fancy settlement for themselves. As well as Thomas Brisbane, a man known as John Thomas Bigg was drafted in by the Colonial Office to look at the state of the Port Jackson colony and to report back with any recommendations for reform going forward. On June the 19th, 1822, Bigg published his report, and he recommended that the convicts there at Port Jackson be given much harsher treatments than had previously been given under Lachlan Macquarie. He gave a list of the types of jobs that certain convicts should be doing. So the most avid criminals should be given the hard labour, the sawing of the wood, the clearing of the land, and the uprooting of certain trees. But the more sound of characters was due to be taken for agricultural purposes and under farming jobs as well. He also recommended better record keeping of the prisoners, more impetus on education for these convicts, but also a general reform to the laws that surrounded the Port Jackson society. But one thing that Bigg also mentioned, which is fundamental to this video, is that he mentions the Moreton Bay area and the possible site that this could have as a new penal colony. With Bigg's report published, Thomas Brisbane, the 6th governor of New South Wales, and indeed the Port Jackson colony, began to implement those ideas. And of course, for the purposes of this video, the idea of a new settlement at the Moreton Bay area. But Thomas Brisbane wasn't just about hard graft and reform. He also was a keen mathematician and an astronomer, setting up the Parramatta Observatory in late 1822. And over the course of his governorship, which lasted until 1825, he compiled a list, a catalogue of all of the stars of the Southern Hemisphere. Thomas Brisbane decides to send his Surveyor General further up the eastern coastline to look for a new site for a new penal colony. His Surveyor General was named John Joseph William Molesworth Oxley. I'll just refer to him as John Oxley from now on. Oxley set off in mid to late 1823 and travelled 1,500 kilometres up the eastern coastline to what is now called a township of Gladstone, before then returning home and exploring a place called Moreton Bay. Moreton Bay was named after the Earl of Moreton by James Cook in the May of 1770, but Captain Cook was just passing through the area and spotted it out in the distance. In 1799, the explorer Matthew Flinders was going up the eastern coastline before his great circumnavigation of Australia and made attempts and initial surveys of this Moreton Bay area. But it wasn't until early December 1823, with John Oxley's expedition, that the Moreton Bay area was properly mapped out and surveyed, including the river that was attached to the bay, which Oxley made a point of naming after his patron, Sir Thomas Brisbane. The Brisbane River runs through the city of Brisbane. Oxley wasn't alone in his surveying missions. When he arrived in the Moreton Bay area, he came across two shipwrecked convicts, Thomas Pamphlet and John Finnegan, who for the last 7 months had been living with or assisted by the local clanspeople living in the area. They had gained an understanding of the Brisbane River and the Moreton Bay area environs. And a lot of what John Oxley's reports mentioned were down to the guidance of these two shipwrecked convicts. One such incident, which occurred in early 1824, was when John Oxley was surveying one of the tributaries, or the creeks, of the Brisbane River. He and his surveying party encountered a number of the local clanspeople that had assisted Pamphlet and Finnegan over the last 7 months. Oxley invited these clanspeople to breakfast one morning. Things were pleasant and going well until one of the men removed, quite forcibly, John Oxley's hat. This was regarded as somewhat of an insult, and a small fight occurred between the two parties. It didn't last very long, and the parties went away. But Oxley named this new creek that he had discovered as Breakfast Creek, after this small incident that occurred in early 1824. Oxley did consider using Breakfast Creek as the site of this new penal colony. It was an abundant fishery and it had a couple of freshwater sources. But it was ultimately passed over as an idea because there was already a lot of local activity going on at Breakfast Creek. This site was culturally and religiously significant to the local groups that lived there. Oxley only went about 20 kilometres up the Brisbane River to a place which is now the suburb called Goodna. In his governmental report, Oxley recommended that Redcliffe Point, which was early found by Matthew Flinders and closer to the Moreton Bay area, should be the perfect site for this new penal colony. And so on the 13th of September 1824, the first group of convicts and Marines to guard them were sent to Redcliffe Point and established the Redcliffe Penal Colony. Returning back to Thomas Brisbane, he has a very unique mark on his life story as well as the story of Australia. You see, in the November and December of 1824, he made the trip from Port Jackson up to the Redcliffe Penal Colony. He took a look around, he surveyed the area, and actually recommended that the site of this penal colony should be moved 15 kilometres up the Brisbane River, from the river mouth, which is where Redcliffe was, to the site which is now the Brisbane city itself. Thomas Brisbane is the only person to whom a city, town or state is dedicated to that actually visited the namesake. This colony was chosen because of its isolation and was only for the most serious of criminals and repeat offenders. But with such an isolated settlement, the nearest township being Port Macquarie, 400 kilometres away, self-sufficiency was key indeed. Whole plains of land were cleared for farming for this new penal colony, including land which is now the Botanical Gardens of Brisbane. It was also picked because of its high elevation across the landscape, and also because it was a fresh water source for the colonists to use. About 100 years later, in 1930, the Brisbane Courier remarked and described this early days of Brisbane, describing the area as a tangled mass of trees, vines, flowering creepers, staghorns, elk horns, towering scrub palms, giant ferns, beautiful and rare orchids, and the wild passion flower. And so the story of Brisbane as a penal colony and a grand city that it is today began on the 13th of May, 1825. Over the next few years and decades of this Brisbane penal colony, and later a free settlement, there was a great impetus to expand the city limits, especially in the agricultural departments. Thomas Brisbane's goal during his tenure as governor was to expand agriculture and explore more of this eastern coastline and more of the continent. But as a result of this expansion and this drive to explore further, there came a number of frontier wars. Basically clashes between the local clanspeoples that had lived in the Moreton Bay area for 65,000 years and those that had come over from Britain for only the last 50 or so. The term squattocracy was used to suggest this sort of squatter position that the penal colonists of the early 19th century had taken. Not every relationship was fraught with antagonism. In fact, there were some local groups that actually traded with the colonists of Moreton Bay, especially in the fisheries that were abundant at Breakfast Creek. Fish from the local groups in return for some grain and governmental supplies. And I think I'm going to end this video right here. I know that last part may have taken a slight turn, but I think it's important to understand the founding of this third most populous city and state capital of Queensland, City of Brisbane, but also to look at the effects that it has had, especially in those early days, on the local peoples who had lived in the area for well over 65,000 years, the effects that the colonists have had on their society and their culture. So, I hope you have enjoyed and learned a lot from this founding video, and I hope to see you next week when we talk a little bit further about the story of Brisbane as a city, and indeed as the state capital of Queensland. Have a good day.